This time on Poll Hub, we're going to talk about polls. Now, you may be thinking, Jay, you've gotten very good at stating the obvious, but we're talking about a specific poll released over the last weekend that had everybody in politics and beyond talking. And Lee returns for his fun fact, this time about America's favorite beverage, according to young people in 1939. And here's a spoiler alert, Lee's favorite is not on that list. We've got a lot to get to, so let's get started. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
And I'm Marengoff.
Last weekend, Saturday morning to be exact, NYTimes released a poll with their polling partner, Siena, about the, national issues, the horse race, presidency, and all that kind of stuff. And then they released more of it on Sunday. And then they released more of it on Monday. There was a lot in there. Whether it required 3 days of releasing is something we'll talk about a little bit later in this segment. But this got a lot of attention. It got a lot of attention, one, because it shows Joe Biden in trouble, or at least with a lot of troubles in terms of the level of support that he has among Americans. And that got a lot of attention because other polls have shown the same thing. But it also got a lot of attention in the polling community, and this is kind of what we want to focus on, because the methodology, there's a lot in there that is maybe different from what we would have seen in the methodology of a New York Times Siena Poll maybe 4 years ago or 8 years ago. And so we want to start there. We're not going to go through all the numbers of what they showed. That's not really the story here. It's been out for a week. I want to start kind of on a basic level. For people who don't understand polling, you start by drawing what's called the sample. And these are the people that you're going to call or text or whatever. You do the poll, and then you get your results, and then you weight those numbers so that they reflect the national population. So if you have 70% women who respond to your poll, there aren't 70% women in the country, so you'd weight the results so that it reflects that. That's an extreme example. We wouldn't have 70% women in a poll. What I want to ask is, on this front end, they did something that I thought was kind of unusual, which is they took voter registration or voter samples, and then they kind of imputed what across the country in all 50 states, the voter samples that they polled would look like to create a national sample, and they polled it. Now, maybe I'm getting this all wrong, but in reading through the methodology, which is extremely deep to read, it seems like there's an awful lot of fiddling going on the front end. I'm going to stop. What do you think?
Well, the first thing is, I think there was, quite a reaction to this poll. And as you mentioned, Jay, because it showed that Trump with 48 was 5 points up in the hypothetical head-to-head toss-up for president over President Biden at 43. And yes, I think polls have generally shown that this is a close race, a point or two either way. I think that it was, the Times, and they certainly know how to present a feature in a way that gets a lot of attention. So there was no surprise there. But as you mentioned, the Times, did have a pretty significant polling group back in the day. And they partnered with CBS, and they were the premier poll. That's not what is set up right now. Two things, though, that I would like to just kind of preface all of this with. There was a lot of a discussion about not trusting the polls. And it's, from the right, from the left. And I think that's just overall a wrong message, because it's not about trust. It's not about belief. It's not about faith. This should be about science. And when it's not about science, well, then we're really in trouble. And that's when people should be wary. So I'd like to just kind of draw a circle around this. It's not about a poll showing, something that you think it should show or something you believe it should show. We really need to focus in on the science. And in that sense, I don't want you to trust any one poll, but you should, we should all take a look at it with a critical eye and a scientific one, which I hope is what you're inkling at, Jay, with your thoughts and questions. The second thing is just kind of an intro, is that this is kind of the culmination of what we have been seeing over the last decade of election forecasters led by data journalists and polling. And I separate out those two because there's a really big difference. Pollsters do work with journalists, and many of them have been hired by media companies, but they were always pollsters first in the sense that they were students of public opinion, statistics and mathematics, yes, but they were also focused on what is public opinion and its relevance in a democracy. And now we have these data journalists who do have, significant and in-depth backgrounds in math and statistics, but they are really about being journalists and in a way that pollsters never were. And the forecasters themselves, they do make assumptions because their goal is really, how do we predict? How do we forecast? How do we understand what's going to happen next? Where public pollsters are really about, well, how do we explain what's happening? And how do we understand how this election might be different from the other? And those are two very different goals. And I think we're seeing them, particularly at the upshot at the Times of the merging of these two things. And they're not always the same.
Yeah, and I just to jump in, Barb, 2016 was a classic example of the difference between polls, the places like Real Clear Politics, the aggregators who kind of like collect all this stuff and put it together and give you some kind of average, and then the forecasters who told you there was a 70 or 80 or 90% chance that Hillary Clinton was going to win. And those are three very different activities, and yet they kind of blur together. And today they say Joe Biden has a problem, which may be true or may not be true, but you can look at other numbers which suggest that that may not be the case, or it certainly may not be as dire a circumstance for Biden as this particular poll indicates. I will say, in defense of them, before I slam it, I will say that transparency is a good thing. Okay. This may have been a little too much of a good thing because it would take, hours, and you might not even be sure totally what you're looking at, even with the transparency.
What do you mean it might? It might take hours.
But let me throw a little monkey wrench into this. Okay, so the exit polls were Super Tuesday, and Super Tuesday looked like everything sort of the same. Donald Trump, wins handily. Joe Biden, there was some talk about the uncommitted growing in Minnesota, whereas it, was not as large in Michigan. But the exit polls also showed that there were a lot of people were Haley supporters and that they weren't going to vote for Donald Trump. If anywhere near the number of Haley supporters saying they weren't going to vote for Donald Trump turns out to be the case, and we don't know right now, we're talking months and months and months to the election. If that were the case, and he loses a lot of the Haley people, in fact, the election would be over, and these numbers would not be telling the story that we need to know.
Right. I want to get back to this poll. So is there anything wrong with this, as you suggested, Lee, very transparent explanation of their methodology? So, Barb, is there anything wrong or any red flags you see in this methodology statement about the sample that has to do with pulling voter files from all 50 states and stratifying by household income and all this other stuff? There's a lot in there that sounds like, to me, again, as a layman and as the journalist side of this, a lot of fiddling.
Well, okay, but is fiddling wrong? Okay, so
it doesn't sound good.
No. Come on. But there are a lot of.
But the gold standard has always been you get a whole bunch of phone numbers, you don't know who you're going to call, and that makes it random. The people you reach are going to be random. This is so far from random.
Okay, but
what they've done.
Hang on just a second. Hang on just a second. Yes, back in the day, we were able to get a whole bunch of phone numbers, randomly select them, and connect with the people and voters around the country or around the world, really, wherever that technology existed and where those lists existed. To say things have changed in polling is probably an understatement. The technology has changed, the communication has changed, our behavior and how we communicate with each other has changed. not only in terms of our face-to-face interactions, which everybody knows has certainly declined. Telephones, we all know who's calling us before we pick up the call. Most of us are also just communicating virtually. So polling has certainly responded to this in a variety of different ways. And there have been many, 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 many experiments and tests. There is a science still behind this. And so the fiddling that you see, Jay, I think is a result of this merger between forecasting and polling, because forecasters don't just take polling data. They don't just take public opinion data. They look at other secondary data, meaning data that they have not collected. In this particular instance, it would be previous election results. It might be economic data. Most of the forecasters call it their special sauce or their proprietary information. So even though there is a lot of transparency in terms of the poll numbers in this, there are still a lot of questions about what was done pre-sample, meaning how the sample was actually derived and developed, which you're alluding to, Jay, and then what was done post data collection, meaning, okay, now we've got this big pot of, interviews that we've done. We've got all this data. We have what are called population parameters, meaning there is real data where someone went out and counted this information and we know it to be fact. Does our sample reflect, what we know to be true and what we know to be fact? And so I think that part of the gap here is that there's a lot of experimentation. Experimentation is a good thing. I'm just not sure that experimentation is good in real time, because you don't know what you've really done. It's not an A/B test. In other words, you don't have that control group and then you're testing something else, which is really the most important thing about science. You make a change, but you make sure that you have a control group so that you know what that one individual change, the difference that is going to make or not make. And so in this particular instance, when we take a look at the numbers, digging down into the Times poll, there's some kind of incongruencies. So for instance, the first thing I took a look at was just, straightforward. What's the difference between the proportion of Democrats and Republicans that are in the poll? When you look at the face of it, you mentioned, Jay, that they polled registered voters. In other words, voters who had already registered to vote. And there are lists of those. And that's not a bad way of going about it. And when they pulled the list, and I don't know if this was random or whether they were trying to reflect a previous election, they had a 5-point gap between Democrats and Republicans, +5 Democrat. And that's about what we all see. However, the results of the poll showed that Democrats were just +1 in their unweighted data, and they were -2 in their weighted data. So what does that say to you? Okay, so let's look back at some presidential elections. When was the last time Republicans were +2 in a presidential election? And the reason why Republicans don't generally outnumber Democrats in a presidential election is because a lot of people vote. Everybody tends to vote, as opposed to just Republicans who are more likely to vote. Well, guess what? We couldn't find that statistic in the exit poll in this century. So right there, you should say, oh, okay, I've got a plus Republican sample. What does that tell me? Is there anything else that's different about this sample than from what I know from past elections and past patterns? And there was a whole truckload of things. Another one was the fact that this particular sample was also incredibly rural. When we look at past vote, we see that about 1 in 5 voters tend to be from a place that they themselves call rural. And about half of the sample comes from suburban areas. Suburban areas are around big cities and also stretch out to some exurban areas as well. So in this poll, we see that instead of being around half, the suburban vote was 41%. So we say, okay, 10 points, there's an error margin, maybe not a big deal. But where was it? 35% of this sample after it was weighted was rural. And that was double what it was in 2016 and 16 percentage points more than it was in 2020. So there's something geographically that's not quite adding up. So there are a lot of things like that in the poll. And I think to talk about those would be a good thing and a good exercise, especially in the context of, well, we sampled differently or we tried to design a survey that was different, because those are interesting conclusions. I would want to know if we were doing state by state, well, what kind of sample do we end up getting? But that's not what the discussion is.
Right.
The results are just assumed to be the conclusions, and then we have to dig down and figure out what was different.
Let me just take this in a slightly different direction, because I get very upset about what happens to the data once it gets released. What's the narrative that it makes? And we're talking about that in the beginning, which says this is not a good poll for Joe Biden. Okay. And if you look at that, as you were saying, Barb, let's look at some of the results. Well, among women, it was even in terms of support for Trump and Biden. You say, when was the last time we had an election where there were more Republicans voting than Democrats? Well, when was the last time an election where there was no gender gap and it didn't favor the Democrats? So that kind of jumped out at me. I know that since the Dobbs decision on the Supreme Court, Democrats have done exceptionally well in all the special elections, I think without exception. And so I would be kind of nervous if I was putting out a sample that sort of looked like this in the end. And the other thing is, the survey itself was under 1,000 people. Now, I don't get hung up on size of samples as much, but people do. And I think the important thing here, the takeaway, is that if you have a sample that's under 1,000 in its aggregate, and then you start drilling down into the subgroups like men or women or people of color or young people, all the different groups, rural, suburban, like you were just talking about, the margin of error increases dramatically for those subgroups. So you end up with a situation where you may be providing a narrative that makes what is the paper of record into the poll of record. And I don't think that's a good leap to make on this. I would also say, Jay, you were talking a lot about fiddling, and I would call your attention to an article that Nate Cohn had written a couple years back in a different election cycle, where he was talking about the issue of weighting, sample balancing at the end. And the article was entitled How One 19-Year-Old Illinois Man Distorted National Averages. Nate Cohn, of course, being the person behind a lot of this data in the Times survey. And what that was, a poll that I believe showed, because of weighting, that blacks were deserting the Democrats. I'm not quite sure what the narrative was, but it showed that when you weight, you can get into some dangerous quicksand. And so I think that that's something to consider here. I'll take Nate Cohn's suggestion that you can get a distorted national average when you have excessive weighting. And I guess I would just say that there's lots of polls. They're going to have lots of results. There were polls since this poll that showed Trump ahead. There have been polls since this poll that have showed Biden ahead. The bottom line is, I think this isn't predictive. We're going to have, another 50 or 100 critical polls going on, not the least of which will happen after the State of the Union that Joe Biden's going to have, where we expect a bounce. And if he doesn't get a bounce, that's a disaster. If he gets a bounce, it's just a bounce. Jay, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so you raised this issue of crosstabs, and I want to shift this a little bit to talk about the journalism side of this.
Good.
And let me start with the crosstabs.
Because I was going to put you on the spot too, Jay.
Right. So the Times runs an article on, I believe it was on Monday, so 3 days after the poll. They got a lot out of this. To their credit, they got a lot out of this. This is modern journalism with a lowercase j, and we'll get to that in a second. One of the pieces they ran, I think on a Monday, was about Hispanics in this poll. Well, Hispanics in this poll accounted for, if you look at the N, which is the number of people they actually talked to, the Hispanics in this poll were all of 128 people. Now, Barb, real quick, do we ever report on the statistical significance of a subgroup of 128 people in one of our national polls.
The only thing we allow is that if we are looking at, for instance, race and how people voted, we make sure that there is at least 100 people in that category to draw some kind of conclusion. However, to do an entire story and to pick out that group, especially one as diverse as the Hispanic population in the country, is a pretty scary thought. But it's not
Right.
like the Times hasn't done that before, and other media sources as well. But
Right.
it is not responsible. I won't go as far to say it's irresponsible, but it's certainly not responsible journalism.
Right. So as a 25-year political reporter, and 15 of those were as a political reporter, I just want to say first off that the Times is still doing better journalism than almost anybody else in the country because they're among the last that have the funds to actually do real amazing journalism. For instance, the article fairly recently about the moms who run their kids' Instagram accounts that was
Yes.
just shocking and incredible. I mean, they're a great news organization. But politics in this country has become covered like sports, in my view. Political journalism isn't really journalism anymore. It's covering it as a sport. It's the horse race. It's the who's up, who's down. What's the inside strategy? All of that may be entertaining, but I don't think it's as informative as covering issues, and that's not what's really done much anymore. And this was a perfect example of that. This was the first 4 stories on Saturday, the first 4 stories on Sunday, and 2 of the top 4 stories on Monday in the Times, including a breaking news alert on Sunday. The poll came out Saturday. A breaking news alert on Sunday at 11 a.m. about one of these poll results. This is clickbait journalism, and that's what the Times is engaged in. And I don't blame Nate Cohn. I do blame the editors, but at the end of the day, they have to make money. And I think that's modern journalism, is that what's happening here is that we're seeing an institution that is still a great institution of journalism that has to make money and compete in this world, and they have to do that by eyeballs and clickbait and getting people ginned up. And they used this poll to do that. And I think that, to me, that's my problem, even more than the methodology. That's my problem with the journalism side of this poll, is that it was used for clickbait. It wasn't used to inform anybody. It is February when they were in the field in this. The election's in November. This does not deserve 10 of the top 12 stories in 3 days.
Was the breaking news on Sunday that there would be more numbers on Monday?
It should have been. It should have been.
Hang on, guys. I mean, I do think there's value. I do think there's value in doing public polls throughout the election season.
Well, there is. We do it. We do it. NPR and PBS do it too with us. But this is different. This was qualitatively and, more importantly, quantitatively different in the way that this was covered in the first weekend of March 2024 when the election's in November 2024.
Yeah, no question. And there are a lot of red flags just in terms of the numbers in this. One of the other ones I just did want to mention is in polling, we have a couple of questions that look at who you vote for and who you voted for. In other words, a future and a past. And one of the things in this poll, which was really striking for me, and I don't have an answer for, is that they had a 5-point Trump lead on who people were planning to support. They had a plus 10 Biden lead on who people had supported in 2020. And I don't know about you guys, but I haven't seen a lot of people changing their minds, especially between Biden and Trump, who are incredibly...
Especially a 15 percentage point change.
Yes. And from a data perspective, and if you're just kind of trying to find the next great way to understand opinion, I'd like it to be done a little bit more in a laboratory and not in real time. But hang on. I mean, the transparency is good. This isn't transparency. This is playing with, your test tubes and chemicals, in a public square. Okay. And you don't know whether something is going to blow up or not. And so in that sense, it can be a very dangerous undertaking, but one that we all need to be aware of and to take the polls for what they are. We have a really close presidential contest right now. We look like we're just going to have a redo of 2020. But a lot has happened between 2020 and November of 2024 and will continue to happen. So I think polling is useful. Certainly the campaigns are using them. The candidates are using them to determine their strategy, to determine their issues, to determine their talking points. There's a lot of value. And the goal of public polls is really to let people in on that secret. And I think we've got to be a little more careful about getting in the forecasting business.
So one of the last point I'll make on this, and then we'll move on, it's a transition point. A lot of different organizations have changed their methodologies as a result of the last few cycles. So
including us.
And there's been articles by Pew Research that Courtney Kennedy has authored, and other pieces have shown just the enormous number of people who are doing polling differently for a variety of reasons, something having to do with cost and other ways. So there's hybrid methods now. We don't know yet what is the best hybrid method to follow. And I think, to get back to your original point, Jay, this is one way of doing it, but we don't know it is the best way, or that it will become the new way that everybody then ends up doing things.
Lee, I think that's a great point. And it does get back to this idea that, one, we're really far out from the election. Two, there's a lot of polls, and we're not like harshing on this particular poll because we don't like a poll. What we're really talking about is that there is a lot going on. There are a lot of polls going out there. Remember that Siena and us were the two, top rated polls in 2022. So it's not like these guys don't know what they're doing or anything. What this is really about is that polling is in transition. We're a long way from the election, and don't put all of your attention and weight into any single poll, or maybe even polling right now this far out from an election.
To go to the fun choice, I would just segue by saying, Jay, I'll drink to that.
Very good.
Anyway, fun fact, 1939, before even I was born, it's after...
What?
Yes, Jay. It's
really?
true.
Really? I thought you were born during the Civil War.
No, that was Pickett's charge. I was not involved with that. Okay, but I would say that in 1939, which I think is really cool to go back in time, there was a survey done on youth in America, and or by youth, of youth, I should say.
No, of youth.
There. And it's supplied to us by our friends at the Roper Center. And the question asked was, 1939, what do you think of as the favorite drink of Americans? Not your favorite drink, but what do you think is the most popular drink? And so, a little bit of surprise here, coffee at 46%. The reputation of coffee as being the most popular, beating everything else by a wide margin. Coca-Cola at 12, beer at 10, milk at 10, tea at 5, and cocktails and highballs at 4, with a don't know in there. But anyway, coffee dominating by a long shot everything else. And obviously this is before there was, decaffeinated coffee, and before there was, diet soda. I mean, we're going way back. Coffee apparently was the drink people thought of choice. Surprised?
Well, that the youth thought.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you made a good catch on this, Lee, is that we're basically asking youth, what do you think of Americans' favorite drink? And what this says to me what surprises me is that kids basically saw their parents drinking coffee and not beer and highballs. And I think that's probably reassuring, I guess. But that's kind of what it strikes me as, is that this is what the perception of youth was at that point, is that this is what adults drink. And I would be really interested if this wasn't very similar to what we'd see now. I think we'd see smart water up there or something like that. But I bet coffee would be really high up on this list too, because kids, they get their moms and dads, take them in their car and go through the drive-thru at Starbucks or whatever. I imagine the poll would not, this is one case where a poll from 1939 might not look all that different from a poll done today.
Yeah, I kind of agree. I was not surprised that coffee was up there, especially when kids are watching what their parents are drinking. They're not watching, what they're drinking after they're supposed to be in bed. So hopefully it's that coffee at the breakfast table, particularly in 1939,
or with dessert after you eat a meal, cup of coffee.
Yeah,
exactly,
with a cigarette.
Exactly. But what I think is interesting is this was done by what was called the Roper Commercial Poll. And though we talk about the Roper Center at Cornell University, which is where most and almost all public polls are archived, there's a lot of really good stuff there. Roper was, in fact, a person and a company that did a lot of commercial work. So what I find interesting is that even in 1939, they still wanted to know what young people thought. So you baby boomers that think, everything just, didn't come around until you guys exploded into the world. Nope. Back then in 1939, Bud Roper was trying to find out by interviewing over 3,100 young people what they thought of the world. So some things have changed and maybe nothing really has.
Smell good ground coffee. That's Maxwell House coffee.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer. Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes Athen Hollis and Rebecca Hendricks.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review.
Positive reviews help other listeners like you find us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal.
If you have questions for us, tweet them at us at Marist Poll.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub.
And with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button.
Click it and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.